October 6, 1927, Cincinnati, Ohio. It was just after 9 in the morning when the quiet of Eden Park shattered, and one car set Imogene Holmes Remus, 35 years old, driving alone through the winding roads above the Ohio River, and another car close behind her was her husband, George Remus. Witnesses would later describe the pursuit as sudden and aggressive. Remus accelerated. He closed the distance. The chase cut through Cincinnati streets and into the park. Vehicles were forced to slow along the curved roadway. Then he maneuvered his car alongside hers and forced her to stop. He stepped out of his car. The morning light was clear. The park was not empty. This was not midnight violence. It was broad daylight in a public place. Remus approached her vehicle. Accounts from newspaper coverage and court testimony agree on the central facts. He confronted her, raised a revolver, and fired a single shot at close range. The bullet struck her in the abdomen. There was no exchange of gunfire, no struggle described in the official record that changed this outcome. One shot. Imogene collapsed inside the car. Bystanders reacted immediately. Police were summoned, and she was transported to a nearby hospital. But the wound was fatal. She died later that morning. Remus did not flee the city. He was taken into custody shortly afterwards. Reports from the time indicate he admitted to firing the shot. The killing was not denied. It was not hidden. It happened in public view. Within hours, Cincinnati newspapers were printing the story. The headlines were stark. The former king of the bootleggers had shot his wife in Eden Park. The essential facts were never in dispute. He pursued her. He forced her car to stop. He shot her. She died from the wound. What would become disputed fiercely, theatrically, and nationally was not whether the act occurred, it was why. So clearly, we're not talking about a gangland ambush, no shadowed alley, no mob reprisal. Just daylight, a revolver, and one fatal shot that ended Imogene Remus's life. So let's slow it down. Before the mansion, before the whiskey warehouses, before the name King of the Bootleggers, who was George Remus before he turned to crime? Remus was born in 1878 in Landsberg, Germany. His family immigrated to the United States when he was a child, settling in Chicago. Like many immigrant families at the time, they arrived with very little. Chicago in the 1800s and 1890s was industrial, crowded, and unforgiving. It rewarded hustle and punished weakness. Remus was described in early accounts as intelligent and ambitious. He was not raised in crime. There's no evidence of gang ties in his youth, no record of early violence. His first profession was respectable. He trained as a pharmacist, and that detail matters because pharmacy required discipline, education, and licensing. It was regulated, structured, controlled. He learned chemistry, precision, documentation, but he didn't stay behind a pharmacy counter. He also studied law. By the early 1900s, Remus had passed the bar and began practicing as a criminal defense attorney in Chicago. Court records confirm he built a reputation representing defendants in murder cases, and he was good at it. He understood juries. He understood technicalities. He understood how to frame doubt. This was not a man fumbling through the system. He mastered it. In an era before forensic science dominated courtrooms, persuasion mattered, narrative mattered. Remus learned how to turn emotional arguments back onto the stage. but his reputation as a skilled defense attorney is supported by court archives and contemporary legal reporting. Financially, he did well. Not fabulously wealthy, but successful. He moved in professional circles. He was educated. He dressed sharply. He spoke with confidence. Before Prohibition, he was not dirty. He was ambitious, and he was observant. As a defense attorney, he saw the revolving door of enforcement. He saw how laws were applied unevenly. He saw how profit and punishment rarely aligned. He also saw something else. When national prohibition loomed on the horizon, most people focused on morality or crime. Remus focused on language. He read it the way only a defense lawyer would, not as a law, as a blueprint. But at this stage, before 1920, he was still operating inside the lines, a licensed attorney, a courtroom strategist, a man who believed intellect could bend outcomes. He divorced his first wife in 1919 and married Imogene the same year. At that point, he was still known primarily as a lawyer. There was no public empire, no liquor throne, just a smart man positioned at the edge of a national shift. The country was about to outlaw booze. Most lawyers prepared for new criminal cases. Remus prepared for scale. Before he ever purchased a distillery, before any federal agents learned his name, he was a first-generation immigrant who climbed the pharmacy to the courtroom, who studied the system until he could predict its movements. The transformation didn't come from desperation, it came from calculation. And that calculation would change his life and eventually end someone else's. When I started looking into the history of George Remus, I began to think, wow, this guy was definitely pretty intelligent. And of course, I had already heard his name. Well, I knew the legend. I knew the guy was smart. I knew that he talked about himself in third person. And I knew that he had a lot to do with bootlegging, but I didn't really know any of the details. By all credible historical accounts, it is fact that George Remus was highly intelligent. He was known for carefully studying the statutes and exploiting any weaknesses. When Prohibition began, most criminals, they smuggled liquor. Remus did something smarter. He read the Volstead Act, line by line, and realized that medicinal alcohol permits were legal. Instead of bootlegging from back alleys, he legally purchased distilleries and warehouses. That required understanding federal licensing, structuring, shell ownership, coordinating interstate distribution, managing large-scale inventory, avoiding early detection. That's not brute force crime, that's system thinking. So it's the legal text. It read like a novel of exceptions, permits, and regulatory language. It was definitely not something anybody wanted to sit around and read. What most people heard was no alcohol. What Remus saw was he sat down with that act and he didn't just skim it, he memorized it. And in that dense legal code, he identified that loophole few others had fully processed. The law allowed whiskey to be manufactured and distributed for medicinal purposes if the distillery and pharmacy held proper license. That wasn't a minor sidestep. It was a legal opening wide enough for a freight train. Instead of fighting bootleggers, Remus became one, but in a way that let him operate inside the framework of the law until the last possible moment. Rather than hiding in shadows, Remus made a strategic geographic move, Cincinnati, and by extension, the Ohio-Kentucky corridor that included Newport. That was the heartland of America's bonded whiskey, warehouses, rack houses, distilleries, and millions of aging barrels sat within a few hundred miles. Remus drained that map like an atlas. He didn't just sell whiskey illegally. He bought the legal right to produce and withdraw it. He purchased distilleries and warehouses, many that already held millions of gallons of bonded spirits. He bought wholesale drug companies and pharmacies. He secured government withdrawal permits to legally take bonded whiskey out of storage for medicinal sale. Then, and this is the twist, his own crews would hijack Remus's legally withdrawn liquor and sell it into the black market. Within 2 short years of his pivot from law to liquor, Remus didn't just sell bootleg whiskey, he controlled it. By some estimates, he owned or controlled upwards of 35% of all the illegal whiskey in the United States. Cigars, trucks, bonded warehouses, and a network of thousands on the payroll made it all possible. One estimate, and guys, this is grounded in historical research, puts Remus's operation at roughly $40 million in annual revenue by the mid-1920s and employing around 3,000 people at a time when $40 million was astronomical. Remus wasn't just another bootlegger. He was closer to a prohibition industrialist than a street peddler. A big empire needs infrastructure, and Remus surrounded himself with distilleries and warehouses. Bourbon and Rye was near Cincinnati in Newport. The medicinal loophole wasn't just about withdrawal permits. It required a network of pharmacies and wholesalers ready to push prescriptions. So then you've also got his drivers, his hijackers, his middlemen. These trucks carrying medicinal whiskey, his own people organized and executed the diversion. So Remus turned his legal supply train into an illegal distribution network. Remus also cultivated relationships and paid for protection. He invested in bribery of law enforcement and even had ties into Washington. This wasn't patchwork crime. It was an operation with lawyers, personnel, permits, and purpose. Remus didn't hide his success. He advertised it. He bought a mansion in Cincinnati's Price Hill neighborhood, furnished it like the place of an oil baron, and threw parties that attracted press and public attention. He lived as though the ban on alcohol was a challenge to be savored rather than obeyed. Reporters called him larger than life. Crowds gathered outside courthouses to hear his arguments. Even popular culture later echoed his image, with some historians connecting him, rightly or mythically, to the inspiration for F. Scott Fitzgerald's Gatsby figure. And man, does he tick all those boxes for the Great Gatsby. What made his rise cinematic also sealed his fate. So many employees, so many warehouses, so many permits, so many diversion points, so much wealth. It was enormous, visible, and vulnerable. And this is kind of what started happening to Capone, right? Once you get so big, people are noticing. They're all looking. Federal prosecutors couldn't ignore him forever. A grand jury eventually indicted Remus on thousands of Volstead Act violations. When they did, his operation collapsed as fast as it had grown, and that was pretty damn fast. But that collapse, the loss of control, wealth, and reputation, it is what brings his story back to Eden Park. Let's talk about how strange he was, though, before we circle on back to him murdering his wife. Because George Remus wasn't just wealthy, he was theatrical, as I had kind of mentioned. By the early 1920s, Remus had made millions, so he buys his sprawling mansion in Cincinnati. The house became less a residence and more like a stage. He didn't live quietly. He threw these huge, extravagant parties during an alcohol ban with tons of alcohol, and he did it openly. The guests of these parties described flowing champagne, orchestras, imported decor, catered spreads, Sounds like a really good party. This wasn't backroom speakeasy glamour. This was defiance in silk gloves. And he didn't act like a man worried about federal agents either. Contemporary press repeatedly noted the spectacle around him, the cars, the clothing, the excess. But the extravagance wasn't just money, it was performance. Remus often referred to himself in third person. And this is something that made me notice him a long time ago when I was reading up on the bootlegging era. I read that he had referred to himself in third person, which was kind of funny. But it's true. It's documented in the newspaper accounts. He would say things like, Remus will handle it, or Remus is generous. It wasn't accidental phrasing. It was cultivated identity. He turned himself into a brand long before branding was a strategy. He liked an audience. Courtrooms were theaters to him. Reporters described him as confident, composed, and even charming under scrutiny. He understood how to dominate a room without raising his voice. That was not accidental. Then there was the generosity, strategic generosity, I should say. Historical accounts note that Remus tipped lavishly. He paid employees well. He rewarded loyalty with visible wealth. He wasn't the tight-fisted mob stereotype. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to be seen as royalty. And here's the odd part. He genuinely seemed to believe the law was something he could outmaneuver indefinitely. And truthfully, he kind of did when I get to the end of the story. But anyways, even after federal scrutiny intensified, he continued living openly. No retreat, no vanishing act. It was not recklessness exactly. It was conviction. He believed that he had engineered a system so well and so clever that it couldn't be undone. He also seemed to enjoy the absurdity of prohibition itself. Friends and observers later suggested he viewed the alcohol ban as hypocritical, a moral law detached from American appetite. Well, he was right about that. It was pretty ridiculous, and it just led to a crapload of crime. But anyways, instead of hiding his contempt, he monetized it and celebrated the profits. I say all of this, but it's important to remember extravagance has weight. The bigger the mansion, the louder the orchestra, the more visible the silk suits, the harder the fall. Because behind the spectacle, federal prosecutors were building cases. Indictments were stacking. In the same newspapers that once described his glamour would eventually describe the unraveling. Another point I'd like to make, though, before we get further into this story, is the importance of where he was and what he did in that particular region in the Cincinnati was strategically positioned. So for anybody who's not familiar with geography, I know there's plenty of Americans who aren't. I have a few friends who aren't, and they're American, or anybody who is overseas and doesn't know where some of these Midwest states are. Cincinnati sits directly on the Ohio River. It's a major transportation artery. It was surrounded by Kentucky distilleries, which I had discussed, and everybody knows about Kentucky's bourbon, right, and whiskey. It had rail connections that fed Chicago, Detroit, and the Midwest. Newport, Kentucky, just across the river, was already developing a reputation for vice, gambling, brothels, and liquor trade. Us moved there around 1920, 1921 and began acquiring assets. It's also important to know that Newport, Kentucky's emerging gambling economy provided demand, and so did Chicago and other northern cities. So Remus's operation fed those markets without requiring territorial street warfare. He was basically the biggest guy on the block. He did not need to build speakeasies. He built supply dominance. And he did it without traditional mafia structure. So even though I'm covering this under the mob is dead, for him, I mean, there was no ethnic crime family hierarchy, no visible gang war footprint, no Tommy gun. He used contracts, corporate ownership, permits, and geography. Cincinnati was the headquarters, Kentucky was the inventory, the Ohio River was the artery. That corridor wasn't just scenery, it is the story. It's the backbone of his empire. So, how did the federal investigators start noticing? I mean, outside of course, him being filthy rich and throwing these huge parties, it was the high volume withdrawals, far beyond typical pharmacy demand, repeated hijackings, shell corporations connected back to Remus, massive profit, inconsistencies with legitimate medicinal distributions. Treasury agents and federal prosecutors began building a paper case, not a shootout case. Remus's empire was corporate in structure, which meant there were contracts, ledgers, warehouse receipts, and permits, and that left documentation. In 1924, federal grand juries began returning indictments against Remus and associates for violations, and he was charged with conspiracy to violate prohibition laws and illegal diversion of bonded whiskey. The government alleged thousands of illegal transactions tied to his network. This wasn't one truckload, this was systematic. By 1925, Remus was tried in federal court and convicted. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and fined. He was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. That's the part people sometimes miss. He wasn't brought down by rival mob violence. And if you watch movies and TV shows, you kind of get caught up in the idea that he was involved with, I mentioned them earlier, Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, Al Capone. I mean, Al Capone was in Chicago, but he actually wasn't involved with that at all. He was brought down by paperwork. Once convicted, federal authorities moved aggressively. Properties were seized, warehouses were taken, inventory was confiscated. Businesses tied to his operation were dismantled. Because his structure relied on legal ownership, the government could attack it legally. While he was in prison, the government essentially disassembled the machine he built. That's when control slipped from his hands. It's the big one, and I've already been talking about it. It's the visibility, right? He lived so extravagantly and openly that made him a political target. And then, to the volume, the scale of his withdrawals, which I mentioned, they were enormous, and that drew attention. So, as smart as this guy was, he was reckless. Early Prohibition, it was chaotic, so he got away with it at first. But once things started to cool down just a little bit, the feds were onto him. He entered the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1925. While there, the empire he had engineered unraveled. And while he sat behind bars, the federal government worked closely with individuals connected to his finances. One of those individuals was his wife. That prison sentence wasn't long by modern standards, not long at all, but it was long enough to destroy his control, drain his wealth, shift loyalties, and plant the seeds of what would happen in 1927. He walked into prison a self-proclaimed king. He walked out to find his throne dismantled. That distinction does matter. He had built his liquor empire. Everything was layered through corporate entities and controlled through legal paperwork. He assumed that prison was temporary and that the machine would keep running in his absence. It didn't. The Fed did not just simply target him as an individual, they targeted the infrastructure. The scale of this was enormous because the scale of his holdings had been enormous. Remus had centralized control. That made it easier for the government to centralize destruction. Money, the thing that had defined him, was evaporating in real time. But the financial collapse was only half of it. At the center of the remaining estate was his wife, Imogene. By the time of his imprisonment, she had been living inside the spectacle of his success. The mansion in Cincinnati, the parties, the public image. She was not an invisible spouse. Contemporary reporting places her socially and financially intertwined with his operations. When Remus went to prison, she remained outside, with access to what was left of the estate. During this period, she became involved in managing financial matters connected to his properties. Federal investigators overlapped directly with those finances. Historical records and trial testimony later established that she cooperated with federal authorities during the asset liquidation process. That cooperation is documented as fact. At the same time, she formed a romantic relationship with Franklin Dodge, a federal prohibition agent who had been involved in investigating Remus's operation. The relationship was not a rumor. It was presented in open court during the 1927 murder trial and widely reported in national newspapers. To understand the psychological fracture, you have to hold these elements together. The government is dismantling his empire. His wife is interacting with federal authorities. She is romantically involved with a federal agent tied to his case. From the outside, this may have been survival. Financial alignment with federal officials could mean protection from total ruin. A relationship with an agent may have offered security in a collapsing environment for her. From inside a prison cell, it looked like betrayal for Remus. Financially, his net worth shrank dramatically during those 2 years. Properties once valued in the millions were tied up in litigation or they were sold. Control over distilleries was gone. Revenue streams vanished. The king of the bootleggers had no kingdom, and control had always been central to his identity. Before prison, he orchestrated movement, barrels, trucks, permits, employees. He controlled contracts. He controlled payroll. He controlled narrative in courtrooms. Prison removes control. During his incarceration, divorce proceedings began. Imogene filed for divorce while he was still serving his sentence. And that legal action signaled something deeper than financial separation for him. Court documents make it clear that Remus believed she had engineered part of his downfall. He claimed she had aligned with federal authorities to seize and liquidate his properties. Now, whether that belief was fully accurate or partly distorted by ego, that's debated. What is not debated is that he felt financially and personally stripped. When he entered prison, he believed the empire would survive him. When he prepared for release in 1927, he understood it had not. The mansion was no longer his sanctuary. Much of his wealth had been consumed by legal action. His marriage was dissolving. The federal agent investigating him had become intimate with his wife. The humiliation was layered. Many prohibition figures lost fortunes without committing murder, so let's remember that. What made this situation combustible was the merging of financial collapse and personal displacement. His wealth was not just money, it was identity. He had branded himself as Remus. He had constructed an image of dominance and mastery over the law. The empire proved that he was smarter than the system. When Remus left prison, he did not step back into stability. He stepped into a vacuum. No empire, no unquestioned loyalty, no intact marriage. The 2 years in Atlanta were not just time served, they were erosion. Not an explosion out of nowhere, but pressure accumulating behind walls he no longer controlled. So wait a minute. Who was his wife? Because history loves to tell the story of the bootleg king, the lawyer, the loophole reader, the ego, the empire. Admittedly, it's been a very interesting story. But who was the woman in the car that morning? Who was Imogene? So she was born in 1892. She was not born into organized crime, and she was not raised inside scandal. Before she ever met Remus, she had already lived a life. She had been married once before to William Holmes, and that marriage ended before she crossed paths with Remus. When she met him, he was still primarily known as a criminal defense attorney. He was polished, educated, charismatic in court, not yet the king of bootleggers. They married in 1919, just before Prohibition. It's important to understand that she married a lawyer on the brink of a pivot, and she probably wasn't aware of the pivot. Then the money came fast. The mansion in Cincinnati, the cars, the parties, the press attention. Contemporary newspapers described her as stylish, visible, socially active. She was photographed. She hosted. She lived inside the spectacle of sudden wealth. If Remus was building a myth around himself, she was standing beside him in the photographs that made it believable. The center of her gravity shifted as well. He was in Atlanta. She was in Cincinnati, surrounded by federal property seizures, legal chaos. She also developed the relationship with Franklin Dodge, and he was the Prohibition agent who had been involved in investigating Remus. And those two facts, they're not rumor, they're truth. But let's take a pause. A woman whose husband built a multi-million-dollar empire through exploiting a federal law, that husband is imprisoned. The government is dismantling his holdings. She is facing financial instability and public scrutiny. So she aligns herself with a federal authority. There's a lot of historians that frame it as pragmatism. Some frame it as betrayal. I suppose it's both. And what we know for certain, she filed for divorce while he was still serving his sentence. That was not a quiet separation. That was legal severance. When Remus later described her in court, he painted her as the architect of his ruin. It's probably not very true, but he claimed she had helped liquidate his fortune. He portrayed her relationship with Dodge as treachery. But court records also show that much of his estate was seized under federal law, independent of her personal choices. That's fact. The government had legal grounds. Once he was convicted, she had nothing to do with it. So who was she? She was a woman who stepped into extraordinary wealth at the height of Prohibition. She was a wife who remained outside prison walls while her husband's empire disappeared. And she was someone who made choices, financial and personal, in a vacuum created by his incarceration and the choices he made. And she became the emotional focal point of his narrative of betrayal. That combination, not a single act, is what ignited Remus's sense of collapse. So let's get back to the beginning of this episode. I started off telling you the story about Remus shooting his wife. He had been released from the federal penitentiary. He returns to Cincinnati, expecting to regain some footing. Instead, total collapse. In the late summer, he knows that most of his estate has been liquidated. His business structure is completely dismantled. Divorce proceedings have been filed and they're underway. He also knows that Imogene is in a relationship with Franklin Dodge, and he knows who Dodge is. That last point becomes central to everything that follows. Newspapers later reported that Remus believed Dodge had manipulated both the prosecution and the financial dismantling of his estate, and that Imogene had aligned herself with Dodge. Whether that perception fully matches the legal mechanics of all of this, it's debated, but his belief in betrayal is documented in court testimony. Through September, divorce proceedings and financial disputes continue. There are documented tensions over property division and remaining assets. So it's not like he got out of prison and just went straight to her and shot her, right? It's building at this point. Remus begins telling people that he has been ruined. Trial testimony later suggests he became increasingly agitated about the loss of money and about Imogene's relationship with Dodge. His defense would later argue that these weeks were marked by emotional instability, humiliation, and jealousy. Divorce tensions intensified. On the morning of October 6th, Remus encounters Imogene in Cincinnati. Accounts vary slightly in minor detail, but the core facts from trial records are consistent. He spotted her driving. He pursued her vehicle. A chase ensued through city streets. He forced her car to stop in Eden Park. This was not a random confrontation. This was a man who had spent weeks stewing over financial collapse, divorce, and public humiliation. Witnesses testified that he exited his vehicle, approached hers, and fired a single shot into her abdomen, close range. She was transported to the hospital and died from the wound. He did not flee. He was arrested shortly after. I think he left the scene, but he didn't go far. This confrontation, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came after 2 years in prison, systematic financial dismantling, divorce proceedings, her visible relationship with a federal agent, and then one morning he saw her car. The trial began with one fact that no one disputed. George Remus shot his wife. There was no mystery about the act itself. He did kill her. Witnesses saw the chase. Witnesses saw him approach the car. Witnesses heard the shot in Eden Park. He was arrested. So the defense did something bold. They did not argue innocence. They argued insanity. The prosecution's case was structurally simple. He pursued her, forced her vehicle to stop, approached, and shot her at close range. That suggested deliberation, control, intent. The defense reframed that timeline. They argued that Remus had suffered an emotional and psychological collapse triggered by a convergence of events, when courtroom psychology was gaining traction but was not yet standardized the way it is today. The defense presented testimony suggesting that Remus experienced a form of temporary insanity driven by extreme emotional distress and jealousy. The framing was precise. They did not claim he had been insane for years. They claimed that at the moment of the shooting, he was mentally overwhelmed, incapable of rational judgment due to betrayal and humiliation. The narrative of the betrayed husband was repeated and reinforced. His legal team emphasized that he had lost not only money but identity. Juries did not view emotional betrayal the way modern courts do. Jealousy carried cultural weight back then. Marital betrayal, particularly involving a federal agent tied to the defendant's prosecution, carried even more. The relationship between Imogene and Franklin was aired in open court. Dodge himself became part of the narrative, not as a defendant, but as a symbol of federal intrusion and personal humiliation. The defense did not just try the shooting, they tried the collapse of an empire. They tried the divorce. They tried Dodge. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. He was not sentenced to life in prison. He was not executed. Instead, he was committed briefly to a mental institution for evaluation, and he was later released. The man who read the Volstead Act for loopholes now found one inside human emotion. And once again, he walked out of confinement. He didn't slip through a technicality. He didn't escape on lack of evidence. He stood there, admitted he shot her, and a jury still said, temporary insanity. 1927, that tells you something about how jealousy was viewed, how male betrayal narratives landed with juries, how celebrity and wealth shaped perception, how early psychiatric testimony could sway outcomes, and here's the part that makes it even more layered. He had been a defense attorney. He understood juries, he understood emotional framing, he understood doubt. So when his own life was on the line, he pivoted the narrative from calculated pursuit to psychological collapse. That's not accidental. And that makes the trial almost more chilling than the shooting. He wasn't declared permanently insane, right? So he wasn't locked away. After several months of observations, doctors determined he was no longer insane. In other words, the temporary part of the temporary insanity, well, that held. He was released in 1928. And that's it. No life sentence, no return to federal prison, no retrial. He walked free. But he didn't rebuild that empire. The fortune was gone. The distillery's gone. He lived another 6 years. That's it. 1935, George Remus died in Covington, Kentucky. reportedly from kidney disease, Bright's disease, according to the death records. He was only 57 years old. The man who once controlled millions in whiskey died with a fraction of that wealth and without the myth he built around himself. In Imogene, she was buried, her name largely overshadowed by his. And that is it. The bootleg king, federal prisoner, wife killer. Insanity acquittal, mental hospital, release, quiet death. If you zoom out, the whole story feels like a prohibition parable. A man reads a loophole, builds an empire, believes he's untouchable, loses control, rewrites his own ending in court, and then history moves on. We cannot clinically diagnose George Remus, of course. He's long dead. There's no formal psychiatric records that survive in full detail. And 1920 psychiatry standards were primitive compared to today. But we can analyze what we know. Clearly, grandiosity and self-mythologizing. I mean, the evidence, he referred to himself in the third person, everybody. Remus will, Remus can, Remus does. Modern language, this aligns with a narcissistic personality. No surprise there. His identity, well, that was fused with status and power. He had to have external validation. He didn't want just wealth, he wanted recognition. His later framing in court focused heavily on betrayal, not responsibility, even though he had set all of this into motion. When I talk about the narcissist part of him, a narcissistic injury, that's huge. He had the combination of financial ruin, public fall from prominence, romantic betrayal, his wife's relationship with another man. This is a textbook scenario for what modern psychology calls narcissistic injury, when identity is built around superiority and mastery. Humiliation can trigger disproportionate emotional response, which is something like shooting your wife. So was he insane? There's no reliable evidence that he suffered from chronic psychosis, delusions unrelated to real events, hallucinations, or cognitive impairment. He did drive a vehicle during a pursuit. He did navigate in traffic. He approached deliberately. He fired a single shot. That's all goal-directed behavior. Modern forensic psychiatry would likely examine this and say, well, he was able to understand the nature of his act. Did he understand it was wrong? Was he incapable of conforming his behavior to the law? Based on documented actions, many modern courts would likely view the behavior as emotionally driven, but legally sane. Temporary insanity in 1927 operated under looser interpretations. He's not a chaotic criminal. He's more like a high-functioning, ego-driven strategist who could not psychologically tolerate collapse. What this is, it's an intimate partner homicide driven by perceived betrayal and status collapse. That's cold, but it's consistent with the facts. He built himself into Remus. When the empire died, that person died with it. And some individuals experience identity death as existential threat. If your self-concept is, I am the smartest man in the room, and the reality says you were beaten, your wife left, the government dismantled you, some personalities implode, some lash out, he lashed out. To be blunt, Remus had the most fragile ego structure if you compare him to some of these other bootleggers. Capone had the most overt aggression. Luciano had the most emotional detachment. Remus is psychologically closer to a disgraced CEO than a mob don, which is what makes him fascinating because he wasn't a gangland stereotype. He was a smart man who couldn't survive humiliation. Capone ruled through fear. Luciano ruled through structure. Remus ruled through ego. And ego was the one thing Prohibition could not protect. You've been listening to Deadly Truth. This was The Mob is Dead. Tonight's story wasn't about Tommy guns and alleyways. It was about a self-made king who believed intellect made him untouchable. George Remus didn't fall in a gang war. He lost control. He lost his empire. he lost his wife. And in the end, he rewrote his own violence as temporary madness, and a jury believed him. If you found this story compelling, follow, rate, and share on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you're listening or watching. It helps keeps these forgotten histories alive. Research for this episode includes federal court records, contemporary newspapers, archives, and historical accounts of Prohibition era enforcement. Deadly Truth is obviously written and recorded by just little old me. Understanding the past doesn't require defending it. Context explains behavior, but it does not absolve power. And remember, the past is not dead. It's just waiting for someone to read the fine print.